This is one of the most hostile construction sites on Earth, 44 degrees below zero. Waves the height of a 6-story building, ice 2 meters thick grinding against the structure all winter long, and bolted to the seabed in the middle of it sits 200,000 tons of concrete and steel, the heaviest thing humanity has ever floated onto the ocean. It should not be possible to build here, and yet engineers did it anyway. All over the planet, in the places the sea is least willing to share, people keep building. Bridges longer than some countries are wide, airports on islands that didn't exist a few decades ago, tunnels buried under shipping lanes, entire cities designed to float. Every one of them is a gamble against water, weather, and time. Some of those gambles paid off spectacularly. Some are quietly losing, and a few have already failed in ways their builders never saw coming. These are the most dangerous megaprojects ever attempted on the sea. Let's begin at the bottom of the world's coldest sea. 200,000 tons. That's the total weight of the Berkut platform, and it has been described as the heaviest structure ever floated offshore. To put that in perspective, a fully loaded Nimitz-class aircraft carrier weighs around 100,000 tons. Berkut is 2 of them, fused into a single drilling rig standing in the Sea of Okhotsk off the eastern coast of Russia. The name means golden eagle. From the air, it looks less like an eagle and more like an industrial island that drifted out to sea and decided to stay. It sits about 25 kilometers off Sakhalin Island, a place so remote that getting there takes 40 minutes by helicopter or 8 hours by boat, and that's only when the weather allows it at all. In thick fog, nothing flies. Workers who've finished their shift can be stranded on the rig for days, sometimes weeks, waiting for the sky to clear. There are no irreplaceable people out here. There's only the next helicopter whenever the capricious Sakhalin weather decides to permit it. Here's what the platform was built to survive. Temperatures down to minus 44 degrees Celsius, waves up to 18 meters, close to 60 feet. Sea ice 2 meters thick pressing against its legs through the entire winter, and most remarkably, an earthquake of magnitude 9. To handle that last one, the engineers did something no offshore oil platform had done before. They placed friction pendulum bearings between the topside and its concrete base, allowing the entire deck to slide and absorb the shock of a massive quake instead of snapping. It was the first time that technology had ever been used in the offshore oil and gas industry. The base alone, the gravity-based structure that holds everything down, weighs roughly 160,000 tons and used around 52,000 cubic meters of concrete and 27,000 tons of steel rebar. And it wasn't built here. It couldn't be. The topside was constructed in a shipyard in South Korea and towed thousands of kilometers across the Pacific. The concrete base was built in eastern Russia. Then the two were brought together and installed in one of the most inhospitable stretches of ocean on the planet. Picture assembling the heaviest object you've ever made, in pieces, on opposite sides of an ocean, and then mating them precisely in freezing water with ice closing in. The whole thing was part of the Sakhalin 1 project, a consortium that at one point represented the largest single foreign direct investment in Russia, with partners from the United States, Japan, India, and Russia. Total cost across the wider development, somewhere between $10 and $12 billion. When it came online, Berkut tapped the Arkutun-Dagi field and was built to pull up to 4.5 million tons of oil a year, around 12,000 tons every single day. A rotating crew of about 200 people lives aboard for weeks at a time, keeping the drilling running around the clock, more than a mile of pipe descending beneath the platform and then bending sideways for kilometers through the rock. So why is it the most dangerous build on this list? Not because anything went catastrophically wrong, because of everything that could have every single day and was engineered against in advance. Most projects fight one enemy. Berkut fights 4 at once: cold, waves, ice, and earthquakes, in a place where rescue is hours away on a good day and impossible on a bad one. It's the closest thing the oil industry has to building on another planet. Honestly, only spaceflight is harder. And that's the strange thing about the most dangerous megaproject on the sea. It didn't fail. It worked. The danger was the whole point. The entire structure is a 200,000-ton argument that humans can plant a factory in the worst water on Earth and make it hold. But holding still in one place is the easy version of this problem. What happens when the thing you're building has to span the danger instead of just sitting in it? 55 kilometers. That's the length of the world's longest sea crossing, stretched across the Pearl River Delta, between Hong Kong, the mainland city of Zhuhai, and the gambling enclave of Macau. It used enough steel to build 60 Eiffel Towers, around 420,000 tons of it. At the peak of construction, there were 14,000 workers and 300 ships in the water at the same time. It was, by one official's account, an extraordinary construction site. It was also a deadly one. Over the roughly 9 years of construction, at least 19 workers died and more than 600 were injured. And those numbers only describe the human cost. The financial and engineering cost tells its own story. The total price tag for the project ran to somewhere around $15 to $20 billion, depending on how you count the artificial islands, link roads, and border facilities. And Hong Kong alone sank about 120 billion Hong Kong dollars into its share. Here's the engineering problem they were solving. You can't just lay a 55-kilometer bridge across the Pearl River Delta because that delta is one of the busiest shipping channels on Earth, the gateway to the factories that build much of what the world buys. A continuous bridge would block the ships. A continuous tunnel would cost a fortune. So they did both. A bridge that dives into an underwater tunnel nearly 7 kilometers long, then climbs back out. And to make that transition possible, they built 2 artificial islands from scratch in the open sea, each anchored by around 100 giant steel cylinders driven into the seabed. The bridge was designed to last 120 years and to survive a magnitude 8 earthquake, a level 16 typhoon, and a direct strike from a 300,000-ton vessel. That last spec stopped being theoretical fast. In 2018, Super Typhoon Berkut slammed into the region with winds that would have destroyed lesser structures. The bridge held. But the story underneath the triumph is messier. There were accusations of corruption. There was a scandal in which lab workers were charged over faked concrete strength tests, falsified results submitted using stronger sample cubes to stand in for the real ones. There were budget overruns and repeated delays. Critics called it a white elephant, pointing out that by some estimates, the bridge might take more than 70 years just to break even. Environmental groups warned it was devastating the habitat of the critically endangered Chinese white dolphin, and one engineering feat captures the sheer audacity of it. To run a tunnel under an existing operating airport railway line in Hong Kong without ever stopping the trains, engineers used a technique called box jacking, pushing prefabricated tunnel segments forward with hydraulic jacks in a slow, caterpillar-like crawl. The jacking force they designed for was 19,400 tons. That's enough force to lift 70 empty Airbus A380s at once. So here's where the danger really lives. It isn't in the typhoon the bridge was built to survive. It's in the 19 names that don't appear on any plaque, and in a quieter question the white dolphins can't ask. When you build something this big, this fast, across water this crowded, who actually pays for it? The bridge will likely stand for a century. Some of the people who built it didn't get to see it open. The Kong-Zhuhai-Macau bridge proved you can conquer the sea by going over it and under it at once. But there's another way humans have tried to beat the ocean, not by crossing it, but by building new land in the middle of it. And that's where things start to sink. In the 1960s, the Japanese city of Osaka had a problem that sounds almost quaint. Its existing airport was so loud that residents were suing over the noise. The solution was anything but quaint. If people on land hate the noise, build the airport where nobody lives. Build it in the sea. What followed became one of the most expensive civil engineering projects in modern history, with total costs eventually exceeding $20 billion. Engineers excavated 3 mountains, barged the earth out into Osaka Bay, and dumped it into 18 meters of water to create an artificial island roughly 4 kilometers long. It was the first airport ever built entirely on a man-made island. When it opened in 1994, it had the longest airport terminal in the world, designed by the celebrated architect Renzo Piano. And from almost the moment it opened, it began to sink. Now the engineers knew it would sink. The seabed under Osaka Bay is soft marine clay. One description compared it to a wet sponge. They planted over 2 million sand drains into that clay to squeeze the water out and speed up the settling. They calculated the island would gradually subside over about 50 years before stabilizing at a safe height above the sea. The island ignored the schedule. By 1990, before the airport had even opened, the first island had already sunk far more than projected. Since opening, Kansai has settled roughly 38 feet, around 12 meters. Portions of the island that were supposed to take half a century to reach their minimum safe elevation got there within 6 years. So engineers did something extraordinary. They didn't fight the sinking. They designed a building that could be perpetually corrected. The terminal sits on 900 columns, each fitted with hydraulic jacks. When a section sinks too far, workers slide metal plates underneath and raise it back up. The runways were paved in flexible asphalt instead of rigid concrete, so they bend with the settling instead of cracking. It is a structure designed to be jacked up forever, for as long as it exists. The bills keep coming. At least $150 million was spent just raising the seawall as the island dropped, and the sinking is uneven. The center of the terminal settles at a different rate than the edges, which is a far harder problem than sinking evenly, because uneven settling is what tears a building apart. Then, the sea reminded everyone who was really in charge. In 2018, Typhoon Jebi drove a storm surge over the airport's defenses and flooded it. A drifting tanker smashed into the only bridge connecting Kansai to the mainland, cutting the island off with thousands of people stranded on it. The airport that had been built to escape the land's problems was, for a few days, a trapped island in a flood. Some engineers project that by the 2050s, sections of the islands could sink another 13 feet, potentially down to sea level itself. And here is the quiet danger of Kansai. It didn't collapse. It didn't fail in a single dramatic instant. Its danger is slow, patient, and permanent. A multi-billion-dollar bet that you can hold a piece of the sea floor above the waterline through sheer engineering willpower, paying for it every year with no finish line. The airport works beautifully. It just never stops drowning, very slowly, and the people who run it have to win that fight again every single day. Kansai sinks because it's made of loose fill on soft clay. But what if you could build land that doesn't sink, out of nothing but sand and rock in the shape of a tree? From space, you can see a palm tree growing out of the Persian Gulf off the coast of Dubai. It is not natural. It is roughly 94 million cubic meters of sand and around 7 million tons of rock, arranged by humans into one of the most recognizable shapes on the planet. The Palm Jumeirah cost around $12 billion and added something like 70 to 80 kilometers of new coastline to a city that had only about 70 kilometers to begin with. It is, depending on who you ask, either Dubai's greatest triumph or its most expensive vanity, and the engineering behind it was genuinely radical. Here's the part most people miss. There is no concrete or steel holding the island together. By the personal order of Dubai's ruler, the palm was built entirely from sand and rock. Just sand and rock, sculpted into shape and held in place against the sea. The method was precise to the point of obsession. Dredgers sprayed sand into exact positions using GPS-guided systems, a technique sometimes called rainbowing for the arc the sand makes in the air. Then the loose sand was compacted by vibration to make it solid enough to build on. Around the whole thing, they built an 11-kilometer crescent breakwater out of rock from 16 quarries, blasting day and night to recover the millions of tons they needed to shield the fronds from the open sea. But the sea doesn't like being rearranged, and the palm has been quietly fighting the consequences ever since. Erosion is the constant enemy. Wind and currents strip away the sand that is the island, and in some areas the mainland shoreline has been eroding by as much as several meters a year, requiring constant, costly maintenance. The construction changed the natural flow of water and sediment along Dubai's coast. Marine biologists documented the damage. More than a square kilometer of coral destroyed by dredging, oyster beds and reefs buried under disturbed sediment, fish that disappeared and may never fully return. Some research found that newborn fish could no longer survive in the altered conditions along the shore. There have been persistent rumors that the Palm is sinking. The developer denies it. What's undeniable is that the sister projects didn't fare as well. The larger Palm Jebel Ali and the World Islands stalled hard after the 2008 financial crisis, when oil prices collapsed from $140 a barrel to $40 and investors fled. The World Islands, in particular, faced reports that the sand making up the islands was slowly slipping back into the sea. Palm Jumeirah itself, the smallest of Dubai's island dreams, is the one that actually worked, packed with mansions, hotels, and tourists, generating enormous revenue. So where's the danger here? Not in a dramatic collapse. The danger of the Palm is that it's a structure with no skeleton, no steel, no concrete core, just compacted sand defended by a rock wall against an ocean that wants its sand back. It survives only as long as someone keeps maintaining it, keeps replacing what erodes, keeps fighting the currents the island itself disrupted. It's a permanent argument with the sea, and the sea is very patient. Dubai built new land and got away with it. The next builders weren't trying to make land at all. They were trying to cross deep, cold, brutal water, and they buried the danger underground, where you'd never see it coming. For more than a century, crossing the Great Belt, the strait separating Denmark's two main islands, meant taking a ferry, an hour on the water, weather permitting, between the eastern island of Zealand, where Copenhagen sits, and the island of Funen to the west. Today, it takes about 10 minutes because Denmark spent roughly a decade and around 21.4 billion Danish kroner building one of the largest engineering projects in the nation's history. The Great Belt Fixed Link is actually 3 structures stitched together across 18 kilometers of water, using a small island in the middle, Sprogo, as a stepping stone. There's the West Bridge, carrying road and rail. There's the East Bridge, a suspension bridge whose main span of 1,624 meters was at the time the longest in the world, with pylons rising 254 meters, making them the tallest structures in all of Denmark. And then there's the part you can't see, the East Tunnel, an 8-kilometer rail tunnel bored beneath the seabed, descending as deep as 75 meters below sea level. That tunnel is where the danger lived. Boring 2 parallel tubes under the sea floor meant working in compressed air conditions to hold back the water and the soft ground. Across the project, 320 workers underwent more than 9,000 individual pressure exposures in the tunnel boring machines. And with compressed air work comes decompression sickness, the same affliction that haunts deep-sea divers. The bends. 2 workers were left with long-term symptoms. The broader construction record is sobering in the plain way these things often are. During the build, 479 work-related accidents were reported. 53 of them resulted in serious injury or death. 7 workers died, and the sea kept testing the structure long after it opened in 1998. The East Bridge stands in an exposed, high-wind strait. In 2019, a freight train was literally blown off its tracks in a storm on the bridge in a collision that killed people. A reminder that even a finished, celebrated piece of infrastructure remains a place where wind and water can still kill. But here's what makes the Great Belt worth understanding. It didn't just connect 2 islands. Combined with the Øresund bridge that came after it, the Great Belt Link turned Denmark into the land bridge between continental Europe and Scandinavia. You can now drive from Germany through Denmark, across to Sweden on fixed connections that didn't exist a generation ago. Traffic across the strait jumped 127% in the first year alone. The danger of the Great Belt wasn't exotic. There was no earthquake to design against, no sinking island. It was the ordinary, grinding danger of putting human beings under the sea floor in pressurized air and on top of a bridge in a wind tunnel. The kind of danger that doesn't make headlines but fills accident logs. 7 names. That's the real cost buried under the 10-minute crossing. The Danes solved the deep, cold crossing by burying part of it. On the other side of the Atlantic, Americans faced an even wider gap of open water, and they answered it with a structure so strange that engineers named it one of the wonders of the modern world. In 1964, after just 42 months of construction, a road opened across the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia that did something almost no one believed could be done. It crossed 17.6 miles of open water where the bay meets the Atlantic Ocean, a place where tides run hard, winds run high, and the water doesn't forgive mistakes. The American Society of Civil Engineers named it one of the 7 engineering wonders of the modern world. What makes the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel so unusual is that it isn't one kind of structure, it's a chain of them. More than 12 miles of low bridges skim just above the water. Then, where the main shipping channels cut through, the roadway dives. 2-mile-long tunnels descend beneath the channels so that ships, including, crucially, Navy vessels heading to and from the Great Naval Base at Norfolk, can pass overhead unobstructed. And to make those dives possible, engineers built 4 artificial islands from scratch in open water, each about 5 acres, as the portals where road becomes tunnel. It was a wild idea, and not everyone wanted it. Critics called it extravagant and dangerous. They warned that storms or an off-course ship could wreck it. They warned there might not even be enough traffic to pay the bonds. And remarkably, no state or federal tax money built it. It was financed entirely by $200 million in toll revenue bonds sold to private investors, paid back to this day by the people who drive across it. The critics weren't wrong about the danger. During construction, the Ash Wednesday storm of 1962 destroyed much of the partly built work and wrecked a custom-built piledriver barge nicknamed Big D, whose legs couldn't be raised above the waves before they snapped. 7 workers died at various points during the build. And the danger never really ended because this structure exists in a place that stays hostile. Ships have hit it. In 1970, a Navy ship struck it during a storm and knocked out a 375-foot section, closing it for 42 days. Barges have hit it, but the most persistent killer is the wind. Out on those low trestles, with nothing to break the gusts, vehicles, especially high-sided trucks, get blown clean through the guardrails and into the bay. When that happens, recovering the wreckage and the people inside can take days. Bodies have been found floating miles away. Over the decades, there have been dozens of fatal accidents on the crossing. There's a haunting detail in the safety record. On one stormy day, trucks were being held back until the wind dropped to what staff judged was a safe level. Then the trucks were cleared to cross. 80 trucks were waiting. 79 made it. A gust caught the last one and threw it off the bridge. That's the danger of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel in a single image. It's not a structure that failed. It's a structure that put a thin ribbon of road across the mouth of the Atlantic and asked ordinary drivers to trust it in conditions that can kill without warning. 79 out of 80 is an extraordinary safety record, unless you were number 80. The Americans crossed the mouth of a bay. Back in Scandinavia, 2 countries were about to attempt something that had eluded engineers for almost a century, and they'd find a war waiting for them on the seabed. People had dreamed of connecting Denmark and Sweden across the Øresund Strait since the late 1800s. For decades, every proposal was turned down, and during the Second World War and the arms race around it, the reason was blunt. Why build something hugely expensive across a strait when it might just get bombed and block the whole waterway? When construction finally began in 1995, that fear turned out to be more than theoretical. As crews worked the seabed, they found 16 unexploded World War II bombs lying on the bottom of the strait. Everyone had to be carefully removed and disarmed before work could continue. The bridge that the war had blocked for half a century was, in the end, partly delayed by the war's leftover explosives. The Øresund link, which opened in 2000, is one of the cleverest pieces of infrastructure in Europe, and it's 3 things at once. From Sweden, A cable-stayed bridge runs nearly 8 kilometers across the strait. The structure weighs around 82,000 tons and carries 4 lanes of road on top, with 2 railway tracks running underneath, inside the girder itself. Then it reaches an artificial island called Paberholm, built from scratch out of seabed material dredged during construction. And there, the railway and road dive into the Drogden Tunnel, a 4-kilometer immersed tube made of 20 enormous concrete segments, each weighing around 55,000 tons, lowered into a trench and joined underwater. Why bury the last stretch in a tunnel instead of continuing the bridge? 3 reasons, and they're elegant. A bridge that tall, that close to Copenhagen Airport, would interfere with aircraft. A continuous bridge could be blocked by ice in the strait, and a tunnel guarantees a clear shipping channel in any weather. So the engineers split the difference. Bridge where a bridge works, tunnel where it doesn't, artificial island to join them. The danger here was different in kind from the others on this list. The Øresund's real hazards were the unexploded ordnance on the seabed, the immense precision required to sink 55,000-ton tunnel segments and have them line up underwater. At one point, a tunnel segment was found to be misaligned and had to be corrected, and the sheer difficulty of 2 nations, 2 governments, 2 legal systems, agreeing on a single structure across a contested historic border. The bridge was finished 3 months ahead of schedule, which for a project this complex is almost suspicious. And the payoff reshaped a region. The 10-minute crossing turned 2 separate countries into a single labor market. Daily commuters grew from a few thousand at opening to tens of millions of crossings a year. When house prices spiked in Copenhagen, Danes simply moved to Sweden and commuted back. A data cable runs through the link, making it a backbone for internet traffic between Central Europe and Scandinavia. The artificial island of Paberholm, meanwhile, was left almost entirely to nature, and biologists now record hundreds of plant species and rare toads colonizing land that didn't exist before 1995. The danger of the Øresund wasn't that it might fall. It's that building it meant diffusing a war's worth of bombs, threading 2 enormous structures together underwater with no margin for error, and trusting that 2 old rival nations could agree on every meter. It's the rare megaproject whose greatest risks were buried in the past and the seabed, and whose builders got almost everything right. 2 nations cooperating built something graceful. The next builder did it alone, at record-breaking scale, and against an enemy that never sleeps: salt water itself. In June 2011, China opened a bridge across Jiaozhou Bay in the eastern city of Qingdao that, by the most commonly cited figure, stretched 41.58 kilometers, and was promptly hailed as the longest bridge over water in the world, surpassing the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway in Louisiana. The roadway bridge itself runs about 26.7 kilometers as part of a larger connection project. The numbers behind it are staggering. It took around 450,000 tons of steel and 2.3 million cubic meters of concrete. It rests on more than 5,000 pillars driven into the seabed. Nearly 20,000 people worked on it around the clock, and they finished it in about 4 years. The whole thing cost somewhere around $1.5 billion and cut roughly 30 kilometers off the trip between 2 districts of Qingdao, shaving 20 to 30 minutes off the drive. But the real adversary at Jiaozhou Bay wasn't time or scale, it was chemistry. Saltwater is the slow assassin of marine infrastructure. Chloride from seawater spray works its way into reinforced concrete and attacks the steel reinforcement inside, corroding it from within until the concrete cracks and spalls. For a bridge designed to stand for around a century, sitting in a corrosive marine environment with constant tidal forces, soft seabed, and salt water exposure, corrosion isn't a possibility. It's a certainty the engineers had to design against for decades into the future. The bridge was built with a targeted service life of 100 years, which means a 100-year war against rust that has only just begun. There were also the more familiar dangers of building at this scale and speed. Engineers faced powerful tides, a soft seabed that doesn't want to hold pillars steady, and the ever-present risk of ship collision and earthquakes, all of which the hybrid cable-stayed and viaduct design had to account for across 6 lanes of traffic. And not long after it opened, the bridge drew sharp scrutiny when reports surfaced of missing or loose guardrail bolts and other finishing problems. Non-structural issues that authorities said they repaired within days, insisting the core viaduct was sound. But the episode crystallized a worry that shadows fast, record-chasing megaprojects everywhere. When you build something this enormous this quickly are the unglamorous details. The bolts, the barriers, the corrosion protection getting the same attention as the record-breaking span. The danger of the Jiaozhou Bay Bridge isn't dramatic. There was no signature disaster, no storm that defined it. Its danger is the quietest one on this entire list: time and salt, working together every hour of every day for 100 years. A bridge this long offers the sea 41 kilometers of surface to attack. Whether it truly lasts a century won't be settled by engineers cutting a ribbon. It'll be settled slowly by chemistry, and the bill for getting the corrosion protection wrong wouldn't come due for decades, long after everyone who built it has moved on. Salt water destroys what humans build, but sometimes humans destroy it themselves. And the next project on this list was killed deliberately, in an instant, by explosives on the seabed. This one is dangerous in a way none of the others are. Not because it was hard to build, though it was, because it was destroyed on purpose. And that act rewrote the rules of what counts as a target. Nord Stream was a pair of natural gas pipelines running along the bottom of the Baltic Sea, built to carry Russian gas directly to Germany, bypassing the overland routes through Eastern Europe. Laying them meant welding and sinking pipe across more than 1,200 kilometers of seabed, through the territorial economic zones of multiple nations, in water up to around 80 meters deep, a marine construction feat in its own right. Then, on the 26th of September 2022, against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, something happened that the entire architecture of European energy had quietly assumed never would. Someone blew them up. A series of underwater explosions ruptured the pipelines near the Danish island of Bornholm in international waters within the Danish and Swedish economic zones. Seismic instruments picked up the blasts. Then the surface of the Baltic began to boil. Vast plumes of methane bubbling up from the severed pipes in what analysts believe may have been the single largest release of methane from human activity ever recorded. The steel of the pipe had been severed cleanly, the ends blown meters apart, a crater gouged into the seabed. Demolition experts who examined it concluded it was the work of shaped charges and trained divers. Swedish and Danish investigators called it deliberate sabotage almost immediately. And then, and this is the genuinely unsettling part, nobody could definitively publicly prove who did it. Swedish and Danish investigations were eventually closed without naming those responsible. A German investigation continued, leading to European arrest warrants and the arrest of Ukrainian suspects in 2025, with reporting pointing toward a pro-Ukraine operation launched from a small sailing yacht called the Andromeda. Russia blamed the West. The West blamed others. Years later, the full truth remained contested. Here's why Nord Stream belongs on a list of the most dangerous megaprojects on the sea, even though its construction wasn't the deadliest. Every other project here fights the natural dangers of the ocean: wind, ice, salt, waves, earthquakes. Nord Stream revealed a new one. It proved that the vast, invisible web of undersea infrastructure that modern civilization runs on, the gas pipelines, the power cables, the data cables carrying the internet between continents, sits on the seabed essentially undefended. and can be severed in a single night by anyone willing to do it. The pipelines lay in plain sight on the map in waters patrolled by some of the most advanced navies on Earth, and the operation, whoever ran it, went undetected until it was done. That's the danger Nord Stream exposed, and it didn't go away when the bubbling stopped. The most sophisticated infrastructure humanity builds on the sea is also the most exposed. We poured engineering genius into building these arteries and almost none into protecting them because we assumed no one would ever be reckless enough to cut them. Someone was. And now every undersea cable and pipeline on the planet is a target that was always there, just waiting for someone to notice. Nord Stream was attacked from outside. The next project faces an enemy that's coming for everyone, slowly and can't be arrested, the rising sea itself. And a famous city decided to build a wall against it. Venice has been fighting the sea for over 1,000 years. In November 1966, the sea nearly won. A catastrophic tide rose 194 centimeters and submerged the city, damaging monuments, museums, and irreplaceable archives. Out of that disaster came a vow to build something that would never let it happen again. It took until 2020, and the story of how MOSE got built is, in many ways, a story about how megaprojects fail, even when they eventually work. MOSE, the name is an acronym for Experimental Electromechanical Module and a deliberate echo of Moses parting the sea, is a system of 78 mobile barriers installed at the 3 inlets where the Venetian lagoon meets the Adriatic. Most of the time, the gates lie flat and hidden on the seabed, full of water, completely invisible so as not to spoil the lagoon. When a dangerous tide is forecast, compressed air is pumped into the gates, forcing the water out. They rise on their hinges and seal the lagoon off from the sea. The whole system can deploy in under 30 minutes. From a pure engineering standpoint, it's a marvel. The problem was never really the engineering. It was everything around it. Construction began in 2003. It was supposed to be finished years before it was. Instead, MOSE became a national symbol of dysfunction, dogged by corruption, mismanagement, and spiraling costs. In 2014, the scandal erupted into the open. The mayor of Venice and around 30 other people were arrested in a sweeping corruption investigation. Bribery, fraud, illegal political financing. Investigators found that a large sum of money intended for the flood barriers had instead been siphoned off to bribe officials and politicians. The final cost ballooned to somewhere around 6 to 7 billion euros, roughly double early estimates, and the project came in around a decade late. And even now that it works, MOSE is haunted by doubt. Activating it costs around 300,000 euros each time. Maintenance is enormous and ongoing. The barriers were designed around sea level assumptions that climate change is steadily overtaking. What used to be a once-a-century flood is now arriving far more often, and experts warn that by the end of the century, the gates may need to close for so many days each year that they choke off the shipping and the natural water exchange the lagoon's ecosystem depends on. Closing the gates, even briefly, disrupts the lagoon's delicate saltwater circulation, and the lowest, most vulnerable part of the city, Piazza San Marco, floods at tide levels below the threshold that triggers the gates. Here's the danger MOSE represents, and it's the most modern danger of all. It's not that the structure might fail mechanically. It worked the first time it was raised in October 2020 and kept Venice dry. The danger is that it might be a brilliant solution to a problem that's already changing faster than the solution can handle. A 6 billion euro wall against a sea that keeps rising higher than the wall was designed for. It's defending a city against the last century's floods, while this century's floods are still accelerating. MOSE buys Venice time. Nobody can say how much, and that's the quiet terror of building against the rising sea. You can win every individual battle, every single high tide, and still be slowly losing the war. But if you can't hold the sea back, maybe the answer is to stop fighting it, to make ships rise and fall with the water, which brings us to a single enormous gate that doubles as a wall against the flood. The Dutch have spent their entire history negotiating with water. About a third of the Netherlands sits below sea level, and the country exists at all only because of an extraordinary inherited discipline of dikes, dams, pumps, and locks. So when they built the largest sea lock in the world, it wasn't a vanity project. It was the latest move in a 1,000-year argument with the ocean. The IJmuiden Sea Lock, opened by the Dutch king in January 2022, sits at the mouth of the North Sea Canal, the gateway to the Port of Amsterdam. It's 500 meters long, 70 meters wide, and 18 meters deep, big enough to hold some of the largest ships afloat, including the world's biggest cruise ships and container vessels. Its steel gates each weigh around 2,400 to 3,000 tons and were so large they had to be shipped 26,000 kilometers from South Korea to be installed. A sea lock is a deceptively simple idea doing a deceptively hard job. It's a watertight chamber that raises and lowers ships between two different water levels, letting massive vessels pass in and out of the canal regardless of the tide. The new lock lets the port handle bigger ships without waiting for favorable water, boosting potential throughput from around 95 million tons a year toward 125 million. And critically, sitting 9 meters above sea level, the lock also serves as a flood defense for the land behind it. The danger and difficulty of IJmuiden came in two forms. The first was the build itself. The project began in 2016 and was supposed to finish in 2019. Instead, it ran more than 2 years late, dogged by a construction fault, and went hundreds of millions of euros over budget, somewhere around 200 to 300 million euros above plan. The builders and the government ended up in a dispute over who was responsible for the overrun. This is the chronic danger of marine megaprojects that rarely makes the highlight reel. Not collapse, but the slow financial bleeding of a build that fights you the whole way. The second danger is subtler, and it's the kind only the Dutch would obsess over. Every time the enormous lock opens, it lets nearly twice as much seawater into the canal as the old lock did. By one estimate, around 10 million kilos of salt each time. That salt forms a dense tongue creeping along the bottom of the canal, threatening to push further inland. And the North Sea Canal water matters. Amsterdam draws on it. Farmers irrigate with it. Too much salt and you've solved a shipping problem while creating a drinking water and agriculture problem. So the Dutch built a special system to selectively pump the heavier salt water back out to sea, solving the problem their own solution created. That's the danger of IJmuiden, and it's a uniquely Dutch one. It's not the dramatic danger of a storm or a collapse. It's the danger of unintended consequences. The way a structure built to solve one problem with the sea quietly creates the next one, salt seeping inland, requiring yet another system in an endless chain of management. The Dutch have made peace with this. They understand better than anyone that you never actually defeat the sea. You just keep negotiating, lock by lock, salt tongue by salt tongue forever. Every project so far has tried to build against the sea, on it, or through it. The last three on this list ask a stranger question. What if you stopped fighting the water entirely and built things designed to float on it, rise with it, and live on it? Here's a problem the renewable energy world ran straight into. The best wind is often far offshore, over deep water. But a normal offshore wind turbine is bolted to the seabed, and that only works in relatively shallow water. Go beyond a certain depth and you simply can't plant a foundation, which means the windiest, most powerful sites on Earth were, for a long time, completely off limits. The answer is as audacious as it sounds. Don't plant the turbine, float it. Off the coast of Norway, about 140 kilometers out in the North Sea, sits Hywind-Tampen, the world's largest floating offshore wind farm. Its 11 turbines aren't fixed to the bottom. They're mounted on enormous cylindrical concrete spar buoys that float upright in the water, ballasted to stay vertical, tethered to the seabed by a shared mooring system in water between 260 and 300 meters deep. Each turbine has blades over 80 meters long, sweeping an area larger than a soccer field, in some of the roughest seas on the planet. It costs somewhere around $740 million, and there's a genuine irony at its heart. This pioneering piece of green technology was built mainly to power oil and gas platforms, the Snor and Gullfaks fields nearby. cutting their emissions by an estimated 200,000 tons of CO2 a year, the equivalent of taking around 100,000 cars off the road. Clean energy in service of fossil fuel extraction. Equinor, the operator, frames it as the first step in transforming an oil province into a broad energy province. The danger and difficulty here are on the bleeding edge of marine engineering. Keeping a structure that talls stable while it floats in waves that never stop, anchored in deep water, is a problem that fixed turbines never have to solve. The project was delayed when a steel shortage caused by the war in Ukraine held up the final turbines, which then missed their weather window and had to wait for spring, because in the North Sea, you don't install a floating turbine whenever you like. You wait, sometimes for months, for the sea to grant you a narrow window of calm. Installation, maintenance, and decommissioning all happen in an environment that can turn lethal with little warning, and much of the technology had to be borrowed and adapted from the offshore oil industry that floating wind is meant, eventually, to replace. There are unresolved questions, too. These turbines have a finite life, and how you repurpose or dispose of a giant floating concrete and steel structure is a problem the industry hasn't fully solved. The mooring systems can interfere with fishing. The full environmental picture is still being studied. But the danger that makes floating wind belong on this list is really the danger of the frontier itself. This is unproven technology deployed at scale in deep and hostile water, betting that we can build power plants that bob on the open ocean and survive decades of storms. Hywind Tampen mostly works. It proved the concept. Whether floating wind can scale up to the 15 or 20% of the offshore market some forecasts imagine, in waters far worse than the North Sea, is a bet the entire industry is now making with billions of dollars. It's the danger of doing something genuinely new on the sea, where the ocean has had millions of years to practice destroying things, and we've had about a decade to practice floating them. Floating a wind turbine is hard enough. The final two projects on this list try to float something far more fragile and far more ambitious. Human beings, entire cities of them. We end with the most ambitious and the most uncertain idea on this entire list. Not a bridge, not a platform, not a wall against the sea, a city that floats on it. The logic driving these projects is brutally simple, and it's the same force lurking behind half the entries on this list. The sea is rising. By the UN's accounting, around 90% of the world's largest cities are vulnerable to rising seas, and hundreds of millions of people could be displaced in the coming decades. When the water comes for the coastlines where most of humanity lives, where does everyone go? One radical answer: up onto the water itself. Two projects have come closest to turning that answer into something real. The first is Oceanics Busan in South Korea, unveiled in 2022 as the world's first prototype sustainable floating city. A partnership between the blue tech company Oceanics, UN Habitat, and the city of Busan, with design by the renowned Bjarke Ingels Group and Samsung's Samu. The vision: interconnected floating platforms, starting with a community of around 12,000 residents and capable of expanding far beyond that, built on platforms designed to rise and fall with the sea. The platforms were to be coated in biorock, a material grown in seawater that's described as stronger than concrete and able to heal itself and support marine life. The city would generate all its own energy on site, grow its own food, and recycle its own water in closed loops. The second is the Maldives Floating City, a joint venture between Dutch developer Dutch Docklands and the government of the Maldives, a nation of around 1,190 low-lying islands, that is, by the grim math of climate change, one of the most threatened countries on Earth. Some projections suggest the Maldives could be largely uninhabitable or submerged within this century. Their floating city, designed by Water Studio in a pattern echoing the swirls of a brain coral, was planned as 5,000 floating units, homes, shops, schools, restaurants, in a lagoon about a 10-minute boat ride from the capital, Male, eventually housing up to 20,000 people. Unlike most floating city dreams, this one had real legal grounding. Government support, a legal framework, actual title deeds for owners. So what's the danger? With these two, the danger is the most honest one on the list. The danger is that they might not actually work at scale, that the dream of the floating city, despite all the renderings and ceremonies and partnerships, runs aground on cost, complexity, and the simple unforgiving difficulty of keeping thousands of people alive and comfortable on the open water. Look at where they actually stand. Oceanics Busan generated enormous excitement and, by some accounts, broke ground on its first phase. But the project has been described as advancing in engineering, while high costs and regulatory hurdles slow broader adoption, and concrete progress has been harder to verify than the publicity suggested. The Maldives project was mired in controversy almost from the start. At one point, a government minister publicly accused the developer of scamming the government, and reporting revealed that lagoons granted for the project had been sold off without dredging even beginning. The developer says the first prototypes are floating in the Maldives, and the scale-up is ready, but acknowledged the project slowed down amid wider instability in the region. It is, in his own words, definitely not what they wanted. This is the pattern with floating cities, and history is unkind to them. Grand vision, real partnerships, beautiful designs, a genuine and urgent problem to solve, and then the slow collision with reality. They are the riskiest kind of megaproject precisely because their danger isn't a storm or a corroding bolt. It's the risk that the whole concept is being asked to mature at city scale faster than anyone actually knows how to deliver, and that the people counting on it most, the ones whose islands are actually disappearing, are the ones who can least afford for it to fail. And yet, someone built a 200,000-ton platform in the worst sea on Earth and made it hold against earthquakes and ice. Someone laid 55 kilometers of road across the busiest delta in the world. Someone is floating wind turbines in the North Sea. The history of the sea is a history of things that were called impossible right up until the moment they weren't. Whether the floating city joins that list, or the long, quiet list of dreams the ocean swallowed, is the open question these projects leave us with. Every project here is a bet that human engineering can hold a line against water, weather, chemistry, and time. Some of those bets have already paid off for decades. Some are still being settled. And a few, the floating cities especially, won't be decided for years yet. The ocean doesn't attack these structures all at once. It's patient, it waits. And the projects that survive aren't the ones that beat the sea, because nobody beats the sea. They're the ones whose builders understood they'd signed up for a fight with no ending, a structure they'd have to defend, maintain, jack up, pump out, and repair for as long as it stood. Which of these projects do you think is the most dangerous? And which would you trust your life to? Is the floating city the future of how we survive rising seas, or the next great dream the ocean swallows? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, check out our episode on Nevada's largest reservoir and why it's drying up. And don't forget to subscribe to SIGNUM for more stories behind the world's greatest and most dangerous feats of engineering.